adaptation by the Japanese themselves. Yataro Iwasaki, the founder of the Mitsubishi Group, came to Nagasaki in 1867 as a samurai of the Tosa clan to get arms from Thomas B. Glover. He learned about Western business from Glover and started his own company on behalf of the clan. After the Meiji Restoration, the clan system was abolished in 1871, and Iwasaki expanded the company, recruiting samurai from the Tosa clan. In the Nagasaki shipyard, 4 component parts testify to the full-blown industrialization after the electrification that took place in the late Meiji period. Mitsubishi No. 3 dry dock was designed by a Japanese engineer. The massive engineered structure of the basin is cut into the bedrock of the sheer mountainside. It represents the successful construction of a dock of modern Western design, its scale being indicative of Mitsubishi's desire to build and repair the world's biggest ships. The No. 3 dry dock was built after the electrification of the shipyard. The earlier dry docks were powered by steam engine. The No. 3 dry dock was equipped with pumps driven by electric motors from Siemens. 3 of the 4 original pumps survive with their electric motors intact and in operation. These component parts are rare in themselves, and rarer in being still in operational use. The pumps and motors illustrate the rapid adoption of the best in Western technology, including electrification, an approach that enabled Nagasaki Shipyard to quickly achieve the world's best practice in shipbuilding technology. The giant cantilever crane in Nagasaki Shipyard was Japan's first electric-powered crane. It was made in 1909 by Appleby Company of Scotland. The crane retains a major proportion of its original fabric, and it's the oldest surviving of only 10 that remain in the world, and one of only 3 that remain operational. It has a 150-ton capacity and was required to lift the heavy machinery of large ships, especially the installation of heavy turbine engines, which the shipyard had just begun manufacturing after a licensing agreement with Charles Arnold Parsons Corporation for domestic production in 1904. Such technology transfer was groundbreaking, its operation fundamental to the progression of Mitsubishi as a world-ranking shipbuilder by 1910. The giant cantilever crane has been a prominent skyline feature in Nagasaki Harbor for over a century. It is a testimony to the history of Nagasaki City, which flourished with the growth of Mitsubishi's shipbuilding industry. Sen Shokaku was planned as a residence for the director of Nagasaki Shipyard in 1904. Following the corporate philosophy of Mitsubishi to welcome important Japanese dignitaries and foreign clients, it was used as a guest house from its completion and is still used for that purpose. Sen Shokaku demonstrates the melding of the Japanese cultural tradition of hospitality with Western-style industrial client relations as part of the transfer of industrialization from the West to the East. The former pattern shop is the oldest existing factory building in Nagasaki shipyard, powered by electricity. Wooden patterns were crafted here to make molds for casting the various components of machines and ship parts, such as propellers. A ceiling-mounted rail system, parts of which survive, was used to hoist and move large and heavy materials around the workshop. Former members of the Tosa clan learned the philosophy of contracts and Western corporate management systems, and adopted and adapted Western science and technology with British support, one of the linchpins of the group's successful Industrial Revolution. Mitsubishi developed the foundation of the Japanese shipbuilding industry at the beginning of the 20th century. Steel is the mother of industry and the basis of national security. Without steel, there can be no industry. When Oshima started pig iron production in Hashino with a Western blast furnace fueled by charcoal in 1858, the US and Europe had already moved forward to the production of steel with the invention of the Bessemer converter. Kamaishi blast furnace operations gradually grew to an industrial scope, forming a basis for the growth of a modern industry. The state-owned Kamaishi Ironworks began production of pig iron in 1880 with the introduction of British technology, but it was not successful. After much experimentation, in 1894, Japan's first blast furnace, fueled by coke, was blown in successfully at Kamaishi Tanaka Ironworks, 185 years after Abraham Darby's pioneering furnace commenced operation in Britain. In 1895, the vote for building iron and steel works was declared in the Diet, supported by Prime Minister Hirobumi Ito, one of the Choshu Five from Hagi. The Meiji government made a decision to build the Imperial Steelworks in the small village of Yawata, near the coal-rich Chikuho area. After Japan gained the capacity of building large vessels, factory machines, and railways, the demand for steel rose dramatically. It was essential for both military and domestic use. The inauguration of the Imperial Steelworks in 1901 marked the beginning of a major phase in Japanese iron and steel technology. This was the nation's first successful integrated iron and steel works, designed according to the latest Western technology available at the time. The steelworks developers undertook research on the best of Western steelmaking, such as the Güterhofen-Jungschütte in Germany, literally the ironworks of Good Hope. Engineers and foremen from Germany were recruited for the inauguration of operations, together with Japanese skilled workers from the Kamaishi Ironworks. The first head office of the Imperial Steelworks was built in 1899, ahead of production facilities. It is an architectural fusion of Japanese and European design, a two-story red brick building with bilateral symmetry and a central dome set in a Japanese tile roof. It was a place where strategic decision-making took place during the establishment of Japan's first integrated iron and steel mill. The former Ford shop is a steel-framed building constructed in 1900 and designed and made with steel products by Güterhofen-Jungschütte. It was originally built for the purpose of manufacturing forgings for machines necessary for the construction of the steelworks. The building was doubled in size in 1909 with an addition that mirrored the original section. Such expansion reflects the sudden growth of steel production. The steel-framed repair shop was also built by Güterhofen-Jungschütte in 1900. It was used for the fabrication and assembling of all parts and repair of machinery used at the steelworks. It is the oldest existing steel structure building in Japan, and more than 100 years later is still a repair shop. The facility houses its original traveling crane, and it is still in use for maintenance work. The The steel frame used in the earlier sections of the workshop were rolled with the mark of the German steel manufacturer Gute Hoffnungsschütte, whilst the latter sections of the expansion phases used steel products made by the Imperial Steelworks in Yawata. This testifies to the rapid technology transfer from Germany to Japan. In February 1901, the number 1 blast furnace was blown in, followed by open hearth furnaces, Bessemer converters, and mills for the manufacture of steel sheets, small and medium sections, rails, and other rolled products. The main equipment supplier was Gute Hoffnungsschütte. In the beginning, the blast furnace was not successful. Japanese engineers modified the design, and successful operation followed in 1904. Yawata established a solid technological foundation and launched a 3-phase expansion program. Their initial annual steel production target was 60,000 tons a year. By 1910, Yawata's annual output exceeded 150,000 tons. The Onga River pumping station was built in 1910 on the east bank of the Onga River. It served and still serves to deliver industrial water to Yawata via an 11.4-kilometer pipeline. This supply is integral to the steel production process and was necessary to cope with the first phase expansion of the Imperial Steelworks. The pumping station comprises 2 attached buildings built in English bonded brick, the boiler with its floor at the ground level and the pump house with its floor set below ground level. A settling basin also remains. The original steam pumps were removed and replaced with the existing electric pumps in the 1950s. The pumping station still supplies approximately 30% of the industrial water needed for steel production at Yawata. By the late Meiji period, full-blown industrialization had been achieved through newly acquired domestic expertise and active adaptation of Western technology to best suit Japanese needs and social traditions. In 1910, the Japan-British exhibition was held in London. The Imperial Steelworks Japan was one of the exhibitors. Their catalogue included all kinds of structural steel for buildings, ships, bridges, light and heavy rails, and boiler plates. This exhibition marked the point at which Japan gained recognition as an industrial nation. Coal was a key commodity for industrialization and one that Japan possessed in abundance. From 1887 to 1907, national coal output increased 8-fold as the dominant source of energy to support rapid Meiji industrialization. Hokkei Pit on Takashima Island is located 14.5 kilometers offshore from Nagasaki Harbor. This is Japan's first modern coal mine, mechanized by steam engine through a joint venture with Thomas B. Glover and later purchased by Mitsubishi. Hashima Island is located 3 kilometers southwest of Takashima, and it was the success of Takashima that led Mitsubishi to purchase this island. Hashima's coal had a low ash and sulfur content, commanded a good price, and was in high demand. As production increased, Hashima expanded with the landfill of coal slag, the new land apron surrounding the island being protected by a high sea wall. In 1900, the mine and island were lit by electricity. This energy revolution prompted introduction of electric winders to what became one of the world-leading ocean collieries. In January 1974, as oil replaced coal in yet another energy revolution, the island colliery was closed and the electricity turned off. Now Hashima is a ruin called Gunkanjima after its resemblance to the silhouette of a battleship. Miike Coal Mine was Japan's second coal mine to be modernized after Takashima Coal Mine. Miike is renowned for its high-quality bituminous coal, but production was a challenge due to excessive groundwater. A massive investment in modern machinery was required to achieve mass production. The modernization of Miike was accomplished by the Mitsui Group of companies. Mitsui had financial capacity to import the largest and most up-to-date Western equipment, which eventually gave way to the production of large-scale mining machinery at a factory of its own. British mining equipment was introduced together with a new adit system for centralized drainage. It was the most advanced Western pumping and winding technology available in Europe at that time. The Miyonohara and Manda pits were the main pits of the Mikkei colliery in the early 20th century. The development of a mass distribution system required railways and electricity and a suitable port, critical for the export of large volumes of coal. Coal production and distribution transformed the rural Japanese landscape into a modern Western-style coal mining cultural landscape. The Meiji government developed the Misumi West Port as one of its first 3 export port projects in 1887. Misumi West Port is the fusion of Japanese civil engineering with the design input of the Dutch architect A. Ruwenhorst Mulder. Mikkei coal was exported from Misumi, but the port was located 44 kilometers from Mikkei, lacked modern coal loading equipment, and was economically inefficient, and was soon abandoned. When Mitsui took over the ownership of Mikkei, Takuma Dan, coal manager and a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, made the decision to develop a modern coal port near the mine. The Ariake Sea is famous for its shallow and marshy tidal flats, with a tidal range of 5.5 meters. It was therefore a major challenge to build the coal port that Mikkei needed. First, they started with the construction of a cofferdam. Then they drained the area of shallow marshy sea. An inner basin was constructed on the dry sea bed, and then the area was reclaimed for coal loading. Next, they built the inner harbor with a pool and dredged a long navigation channel to the Ariake Sea, building a pair of breakwater groins to prevent siltation and provide deep water for larger vessels to enter the port. The port was completed in 1908 and in plan resembled the shape of a hummingbird, a masterpiece of civil engineering created with the cutting-edge technology of Meiji Japan. The hummingbird port design successfully enabled large ships to moor both in the large outer harbor and in the inner floating basin. Hydraulic lock gates maintain the water level in the inner floating basin at more than 8.5 meters, allowing the mechanical coal loading of large steamships regardless of the tide. The hydraulic equipment and control building remain much as they did when first installed in 1908. The lock gates were manufactured by Thames Civil Engineering Limited of the UK and installed by the Mikkei Machinery Company. Each gate uses as a seal a piece of green hardwood imported from South America that's resistant to insects and corrosion. The bottom of each gate has rollers which run over an arc-shaped rail, being operated by a hydraulic ram. Adjacent to the top of each gate is a 15-ton electric capstan to control ships moving through. The lock gate operation room was built on the northern side of the lock. On either side of the lock gates is a set of sluice gates used to equalize the water level within the dock with that of the tidal level outside the dock before the lock gate is opened. The sluices comprise a series of openings between brick piles, the metal sluice boards being raised and lowered by chains attached to a line shaft linked to a motor. The lock gate and sluice system is still in regular use. Throughout the 19th century, coal transport and coal loading into ships were unmechanized, depending almost wholly on manual labor. When Mitsui opened the Mikkei port, it was electrified and equipped with a rank of fully mechanized bulk coal loaders on the wharf. The Mike coal mine and port illustrate a rapid absorption and adaptation of engineering principles by Japanese engineers and their application to the successful industrialization of the country by the early 20th century. The 23 component parts are the best and the only surviving examples of the key attributes that are necessary to express outstanding universal value. The property as a whole has a high degree of authenticity as the best surviving suite of industrial remains, representing the first successful transfer of industrialization from the West to a non-Western nation. All of the important elements that support justification criteria 2, 3, and 4 are contained in the nominated property. Criterion 2. The sites collectively exhibit an important interchange of human values on developments in technology. Criterion 3. It bears a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition which is living. And Criterion 4, an outstanding technological ensemble that illustrates a significant stage in human history, namely the transfer of industrialization to Asia from the West.
本意三群は、日本がものづくり大国となる基礎を作った歴史を物語るものであり、稼働中の民間企業による大規模な工業関連施設の登録は、文化遺産の保全の新たなモデルを提示するものとして、国際的な期待に応えられることになるものと考えました。
The Cabinet Secretariat of the Government of Japan shall take full responsibility and meet all international obligations and requirements of the State Party. Under the strategic framework, all relevant government ministries will now participate in World Heritage protection as members of a partnership. One of the Choshu Five, Yozo Yamao, who left Japan in 1863 with the aspiration to develop industrial Japan, studied as an apprentice at the Glasgow shipyard and later became Minister of Public Works. He has been quoted as saying, "Even if there is no industry at present in Japan, if we train a man, he will find an industry to create." After the encounter with science and technology, samurai decided to lay down the sword in 1876, and Japan accepted a wave of industrial revolution from the West, followed by the accomplishment of the Meiji Restoration. Railroads were built, infrastructure was developed, and a market economy was growing. Feudal Japan, which was isolated from Western industrialization in 1853, became an industrial nation at the beginning of the 20th century. The successful transfer of the Industrial Revolution from the West to Japan was achieved in just a little over 50 years, with Japan maintaining control of the industrialization process on its own terms.
Daihén 素晴らしい分かりやすい映像で、個人的な感想で恐縮ですが感銘を受けました。それではこれをもちまして開会式を終了させていただきます。引き続き基調講演に入らせていただきます。基調講演の最初はアメリカにおける鉄鋼遺産の保全と題しましてパトリック・マーチン様にご講演していただきます。パトリック・マーチン様はアメリカ・ミシガン技術大学の考古学科教授として教鞭を取られる傍ら、産業遺産の国際的専門機関である国際産業遺産保存委員会の会長やアメリカ産業考古学会の事務局長を務めておられ、国際的にご活躍されている産業考古学の第一人者であります。それではパトリック・マーチン様、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much for your attention. And I want to thank the sponsors for this opportunity, both to address this audience and to visit a number of these very important sites in this past week. I'm very much impressed with the progress that you've made. And since we're a little tight on time, I'm going to launch right away. Since the establishment of the Virginia colony at Jamestown in the beginning of the 17th century, the production of iron and steel in America has been a central element of the economy and of the culture of our nation. The new land, despite its abundance of natural resources, remained dependent upon Great Britain for some decades when it came to both the technology and the production of iron and steel. But a fundamental desire was evident from the beginning, that Americans must find the means to overcome this dependence, and overcome they did. From simple furnaces and bloomeries in places such as Falling Creek in the Virginia Piedmont to Saugus in Massachusetts, the early colonists sought to establish self-sufficient iron production. With technical expertise derived from England and other places in Europe, they tackled new and unfamiliar iron ores as they expanded inland from the East Coast. Over the decades, their experience and investments grew in tandem with the exposure of extensive additional deposits of raw material, and American iron became a global provider and contender in scale and value. The story of American iron and steel is central to the narrative of the American nation. The physical remnants of that story are powerful reminders of the events and trends that shaped a history with global reach and influence. Since iron and steel production became such large-scale undertakings, requiring massive mining operations for ore and fuel, enormous mills for production, communities to support large workforces and transportation networks to move materials and products, it's necessary to employ a landscape scale view to understand, appreciate, and manage these important loci of production. The cultural landscape perspective, therefore, is an appropriate frame for exploring American iron and steel as an element of heritage for preservation and interpretation. As an archaeologist myself, I adopt a decidedly materialist, linear view of the history and future of iron and steel landscapes, not delving into postmodern rhetoric that is best left to others. And I will not attempt a comprehensive historical narrative today either. There are a variety of published works that do a much better job. Rather, I'll attempt to describe for you the current state of iron and steel heritage landscapes in the United States, with some examples of both good practices and some less than good outcomes. In the end, I'll tell a tale that has some sad and depressing components, along with some encouraging and positive elements as well. The 17th century roots of American iron are characterized by small-scale operations at a place called Falling Creek in Virginia by 1621, with a larger furnace built at Saugus in Massachusetts in the 1640s. Scattered small forges and bloomeries served the needs of local consumption, but industrial-scale operations were not successful until the next century due to technical shortcomings and the availability of cheap British and Swedish iron. During the 18th century, a new adaptation known as the iron plantation in the mid-Atlantic region, where complexes included blast furnaces, extensive woodlands for fuel, and communities for housing and food production were combined into commercial enterprises. Meanwhile, numerous furnaces were built in the Hudson Highlands of New York and New Jersey, as well as many furnaces in Pennsylvania, the leading producers of the era, near to the extensive iron deposits. In the Northeast, iron makers took advantage of abundant wood for fuel and water for power, with dozens of furnaces built in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Before the century ended, America was the third largest producer of iron in the world. In the 19th century, both Pennsylvania and New Jersey region benefited extensively from the shift to coal as fuel, the opening of vast coal fields, and the expansion of canal and railroad networks for transportation of raw materials and products to market. New furnaces in Ohio and Kentucky were shipping pig iron to rolling mills to make railroad rail, and the Pittsburgh region began its significant growth in the second half of the 19th century. Extensive new iron deposits came to light in the Lake Superior Basin of Michigan and Minnesota, providing ore both for local production as well as furnishing material for growing complexes at lower Great Lakes port cities such as Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo. Some new fields developed in the South as well, in places like Alabama and Tennessee especially. The addition of many puddling furnaces allowed an increase in production of wrought iron consumed in quantity by rolling mills making merchant iron in sheets, plates, and bars. During this second half of the 19th century, the new production techniques of the Siemens open hearth and Bessemer converter provided impetus to great expansion for both domestic and international markets. American experiments with these pneumatic steelmaking came close to fruition with some production near Detroit in 1864 and a Bessemer converter in operation in Troy, New York by 1865. By the early 1880s, several steel makers were using American pig iron to produce steel, especially for use in railroad rails, and production levels were increasing rapidly. The 20th century adoption of steel and its near universal application across all types of manufacturing construction resulted in massive expansion of facilities. Here, the Republic Steel in Cleveland, Ohio. The industry is characterized by integrated steel plants with furnaces, coke ovens, rolling mills, and foundries connected to ore and coal by railroads. Andrew Carnegie, centered in Pittsburgh, produced profits exceeding $40 million per year by the turn of the 19th century, when he sold out to the new U.S. Steel. With plants scattered across the eastern U.S., U.S. Steel was arguably the world's first $1 billion a year company, with steel output accounting for 30% of world production. The American steel industry blossomed during the early decades of the 20th century, stimulated by the global conflicts of two world wars. Productivity peaked in the post-war years, but soon after began to spiral down as problems with competition, costs, and management combined to end the boom years. The failure of big steel in America left the physical and social infrastructure that had fueled the boom in jeopardy, with major producers struggling to survive and renew into the 1980s, only to succumb to forces beyond their control. It's these 20th century giants that left the most significant physical footprints, as well as social and cultural and economic impacts. Yet, as we will see, they do not necessarily represent the dominant heritage component of American iron and steel landscapes today. As is often the case with industrial expansion, when facilities expand, they destroy earlier workings, cannibalizing themselves in the process. Therefore, the rapid growth of American iron and steel often spelled the death knell to historical establishments. However, the concomitant expansion of industrial frontiers and the relatively broad geographic scope of the American experience compared to other countries meant that redundant structures and whole landscapes were sometimes simply abandoned and preserved by neglect. In the case of iron and steel, many early furnaces dot the rural landscape and sometimes even are found in urban areas, in varying states of preservation. In fact, I suspect that the masonry blast furnace is the single most common iron-related artifact in America today. Often combined with charcoal and lime kilns, many times with a dam for producing water power, these iconic structures and complexes are the most widespread and visible remnants of America's Iron Age. Spread quite widely, even into the areas where iron-making experiments did not prove so successful, preserved and ruined furnaces can be found from coast to coast by the hundreds in the eastern half of the country, but even in the dry Southwest in places such as Utah and the moister environments of Oregon. Some examples from my own experience in archaeological practices are the charcoal furnaces at Fayette on the Lake Michigan shores of the Garden Peninsula, dating 1867 to 1891, shown here, and the smaller Bay furnace on the Lake Superior shore east of Marquette, 1869 to 1877. Both of these sites are preserved within campgrounds, in one case within a state park, in another in the national forest. Now, the large-scale complexes that characterize American steel in the 20th century have mostly fallen to the scrapper's torch and have been recycled. I'll mention a few preserved examples today, notable for their inclusion in heritage preservation schemes. Of particular interest are Bethlehem's home plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the Carnegie U.S. Steel Homestead Works near Pittsburgh, and the Sloss Furnace Complex in Birmingham, Alabama. Bethlehem was the second largest of the 20th century steel producers, growing out of a significant 19th century base with a focus on military production of armor plate for warships and large caliber naval guns. While ordnance continued to be a major component of Bethlehem's product base throughout their history, the large and long I-beams they manufactured for the construction industry also distinguished Bethlehem and sustained profitability into the age of skyscrapers. Bethlehem grew not only in the home plant, but also through acquisition and construction in other localities, such as Sparrows Point in Baltimore, Maryland, and the Lackawanna plant near Buffalo, New York, as well as shipyards on both coasts. Bethlehem prospered until an 1959 strike that effectively crippled the firm, along with growing international competition. Despite a series of attempts at rejuvenation, the home plant closed in 1995, and the company declared bankruptcy in 2001. Meanwhile, Bethlehem Steel explored a variety of options for reuse of the site, among the most ambitious being an agreement with the Smithsonian Institution for a long-term loan of artifacts from the Centennial Exhibition of 1876 to form the core of a new National Museum of Industrial History, seen here in their website. This effort was organized within a plan called Bethlehem Works, a visionary concept that included not only museum and cultural venues, but also university buildings, recreation areas, and continuation of commercial activities such as a multimodal transportation facility. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency established plans for remediation of the 1,800-acre brownfield site, and initial funding flowed from the state of Pennsylvania to plan these important community and economic development projects. Local citizens groups, such as one known as Save Our Steel, expressed concern about the plans and mobilized to influence the outcomes. This image of a tattoo on a young woman's back is somehow indicative of the depth of feeling on this matter. As plans stalled and shifted during the early years of the decade, various players from the region and beyond voiced opinions in favor of heritage conservation instead of the economic development motivations that they saw as driving most plans. Meanwhile, new investors acquired the site and quickly brought in partners from the gambling industry to secure one of Pennsylvania's newly approved gaming permits. The new casino and hotel complex that was opened in 2009 on about 120 acres that includes much of the industrial core, based on a reported $800 million investment. In 2009, construction also began on a new complex, not in rehabilitated existing buildings adjacent to the iconic steel stacks of the blast furnace, but to house arts and cultural organizations and host events from music to farmers markets. Just as an aside, this is the remaining element known as steel stacks. These are the new arts structures built in amongst the original productive structures. The National Museum of Industrial History has yet to open on its 10-acre site after exterior renovations to one historic building. There was promise for a ground floor opening in 2013, but that has not happened. Fundraising efforts continue, with $17 million of the $29 million estimated cost raised to this date, and $19 million expended. This year, the longtime museum director resigned in the wake of a grand jury investigation of fraud and mismanagement. The complex relationship with the community has with these plans is fueled by the income generated by casino operation and the activity generated by events in the steel stacks and ArtQuest spaces seen here. To say that opinions vary widely about these results is a massive understatement, and we wait with bated breath to see what will happen next. Meanwhile, Carnegie Steel, followed by U.S. Steel, anchored an extensive array of industrial facilities focused on coal and steel, as well as glass, copper, brass, and other products along 150 miles of riverfront in western Pennsylvania. Centered on Pittsburgh, where the confluence of the Monongahela and the Allegheny form the beginning of the Ohio River, this natural transportation context links the rich iron, coal, and timber resources of the region with national and global markets. Carnegie's works began in 1875 in an area where iron foundries were already well established, and he acquired the Homestead Works in 1888. The embrace of open hearth steelmaking facilitated the rapid growth of the company by the turn of the century, with successor U.S. Steel ranking as the largest producer. While there were dozens of other steel makers in the region, Homestead had particular significance for several reasons. It was a very large and successful plant, occupying more than 500 acres on both banks of the Monongahela. It boasted some of the largest capacity equipment in the industry, but it was also famously the site of one of America's bloodiest labor conflicts. In 1892, following a strike and a lockout, an open battle broke out between members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the Carnegie Steel Company, represented by armed agents of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed, the militia was called in, and the union ultimately was broken. This single event is widely recognized in the annals of U.S. labor history. As was the case with other American steel producers, U.S. Steel succumbed to the complex pressures of international competition and management problems, closing Homestead in 1986, along with most of the other productive facilities in the region. A task force concerned with heritage preservation was formed immediately, in conjunction with a state and federal documentation project and a plan for a national park. America's Industrial Heritage Project, as it was called, was an ambitious effort to identify and record the physical heritage of American industrialization as it was expressed in the southwestern counties of Pennsylvania. Fueled by both local interest and political clout, the Historic American Engineering Record organized and managed multiple projects to record mining, milling, transportation, and community resources in this rich industrial region. They enjoyed investment and partnership with a number of state and federal agencies and institutions. Out of that, the Steel Industry Heritage Corporation was founded in 1990 to work for formal designation of a heritage area, which was established in 1996 by an act of Congress as the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area. The Steel Industry Heritage Corporation is the managing body of Rivers of Steel, working diligently to, quote, conserve, interpret, promote, and develop the industrial and cultural heritage of steel and related industrial resources within an extensive 8-county area. Rivers of Steel serves as a focal point for a wide range of organizations and initiatives. Early on, they identified the Homestead Works as a prime and significant site for preservation and gained substantial support from communities and government. But they have faced serious obstacles. Note here the Homestead Works in 1965 and Homestead today, which is a shopping mall. The scrap value of the large site was too much for the owners to ignore, so the plant was demolished. A subsequent developer saw further value in the riverfront real estate. So today, the waterfront at Homestead, the name of the mall, houses over 70 shops and entertainment venues, preserving only minimal elements of the Homestead Works. And you note this single cluster of smokestacks here in the midst of what was a 500-acre property. The waterfront has adopted the line of large smokestacks left from the mill as their logo, but the stacks stand like disembodied columns on one edge of the property. Rivers of Steel managed to negotiate preservation of one standing building in the opposite end of the property, the pump house, which was associated with the Battle of Homestead. Rivers of Steel also owns the Bost Building, a structure where Union headquarters was located, a few blocks from the site. In 2005, Rivers of Steel convinced Allegheny County to acquire the remnant furnaces of the Cary furnace portion of the Homestead Works, located across the river from the main works, to accompany the hot metal bridge, a transport link from furnace to mill. The recent receipt of a $500,000 stabilization grant is coupled with a very active volunteer program that promises to secure the furnaces while a piece of federal legislation works through the Congress to declare this a part of the national park system. This is not a foregone conclusion. Stay tuned. The Sloss furnaces are an example in the South of post-Civil War expansion of iron production that brought 2 new blast furnaces to Birmingham, Alabama in 1880. Operated until 1971, the complex underwent a series of expansions and modernizations that allowed profitable and extensive production. As was common especially in the South, Sloss was a highly segregated workplace and community, with African American laborers largely relegated to the lower skilled and lower paid jobs. This social dimension of the site's history is explored in the current interpretive programs at the site, along with the economic and technological aspects of the place. When Sloss ceased production, it seemed doomed to demolition until a local citizens group raised community consciousness and generated a bond issue that allowed the city to acquire and stabilize the site by 1977. Documentation by the Historic American Engineering Record confirmed the site's significance, and it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2000. Sloss is now part of the city's park system and a nonprofit foundation with 2 large furnaces and 40-some other structures, not only interpreting the steel history of the site and the community, but also serving as a cultural center for community events. Sloss has been innovative in conservation, but also creative in making appropriate adaptive uses of the site, hosting a national conference of cast iron art, as well as regular metal arts workshops, and numerous music events in the large casting sheds that flank the blast furnaces. Sloss is really the only relatively intact big iron and steel site preserved and interpreted in the U.S. today, with a focus on heritage conservation. This is something of an enigma to heritage professionals, both here and abroad. Why aren't there equivalents to Völklingen and the Emscher Park in Germany? Why are there no World Heritage iron and steel sites in the USA? Or any U.S. industrial heritage sites on the list, for that matter. These questions recur in conferences, in classrooms, and private discussions. Why aren't there any examples like the European route of industrial heritage in the US, or the famous Iron Bridge on the Severn. We can turn to simplistic cultural or economic explanations, such as the overwhelming drive of progress and excessive expense of conservation. Of course, these explanations have some validity, but they are not totally satisfying. What is it about America during the last few decades that has made us fail to appreciate industrial heritage sites, particularly those related to iron and steel, while our friends and our neighbors abroad have done a better job of it? In recent conversations, some common themes arise. Even in the eyes of the preservation-friendly public, industrial sites present significant problems. They're too big. They're too complex. Smaller and simpler masonry furnaces are much more easily managed and maintained. They're often nasty, even dangerous. This point is regularly overstated, but clearly an element of reality in the public eye. See, for example, this recent book, Polluted and Dangerous, and it's a descriptive acronym applied to industrial heritage sites. High TOADS, high impact, temporarily obsolete, abandoned, derelict sites. This abandoned derelict site is the Youngstown Steelworks. They're seen as inflexible, with large spaces that are only good for certain kinds of adaptive uses, not easily modified. However, SLOS puts the lie to that conclusion with its casting shed in use for many days of the year, for all sorts of events. They are expensive, with ongoing maintenance and repair costs, out of scale with the budget of small groups and governments, hence only supported or supportable by big government or by big corporations. And they're often the locus of negative emotions regarding loss of jobs and the economic base following closures and environmental degradation. In fact, these troubling histories are often the most powerful element of the stories, bringing out elements of labor and immigration history, as well as technological and industrial themes. So what can be done? What can we do to make a success of heritage management? Our National Park Service heritage documentation programs have done a wonderful job over the decades, with projects on hundreds of sites, including some of those I've just shown you, establishing high standards of professional practice, providing public access to drawings, photos, and text through the Library of Congress. Other groups and individuals are also doing remarkable work to record tangible resources before they disappear. A handsome recent publication by Joseph Elliott reproduces photos that he shot over the last several years of operation at Bethlehem's home plant. The steel, photographs of the Bethlehem steel plant, has just been released. Elliott gained his original access as part of a HAIR team, but carried his work beyond the formal documentation. Another photographer, Benjamin Halpern, has just embarked on a project to photographically document a group of steel mills on the Ohio River downstream from Pittsburgh. Mills and facilities at Mingo Junction in Ohio and Weirton in West Virginia have been closed in recent years, and Halpern's group has gained access for documentation before demolition. These sites take on some particular interest because at least one, if not more, are targeted for a new type of reuse after demolition in the context of the new resource boom of natural gas production through hydraulic fracturing or fracking. This effort is supported by significant voluntary effort, but also through a series of small grants to support public exhibitions in the region. Another source of hope for preservation is the National Heritage Area Program, administered through the National Park Service. A partnership program that links federal, state, and local entities in heritage conservation efforts. Since 1984, 49 areas have been named, including several that have strong industrial heritage themes, among them Rivers of Steel and the Erie Canal. They are to advance the national park idea without necessarily becoming parks. They embrace the landscape perspective with broad and inclusive boundaries and encourage collaboration and cooperation such as we're seeing here in Kyushu Yamaguchi. Education must be at the core of any preservation action. While regeneration can be limited in scope to economic activity, we hope that cultural regeneration will naturally involve where education is a central mission. We face a postmodern public, most of whom have little, if any, direct personal experience with industry, much less the production of iron and steel. Broadening the educational experience can be accomplished on conserved sites and in museums through outreach to schools. Some recent efforts for education in the U.S. include the publication of proceedings from a conference held by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in their Forum Journal. Access, by the way, access to this publication is free through the Tiki website. I'm also proud to promote the recent publication of Industrial Heritage Retooled by Tiki. Stimulated by discussions at the aforementioned conference, this book takes a global look at key best practices of industrial heritage conservation. I'm happy also to say that we've attracted additional support from an American foundation with interest in historic preservation. The Kaplan Fund supported the conference that generated these publications. We've recently engaged in a comprehensive national inventory of industrial heritage sites, building on work done by others. In conclusion, I hope that the transgressive thrill-seeking of urban exploration is not the only way to satisfy public curiosity about these places that are so important and so evocative of a lost past. The work of national and international organizations is our main hope for making progress in the future. Hope that we aren't forced to rely on sculpture gardens with a few scattered bits of industrial heritage to represent this important element of our past. While the smoky, massive complexes of big steel with thousands of workers and their communities are a thing of past in America, we don't have to turn our backs and forget them. Through the efforts of motivated individuals, communities, and institutions, there remains some hope for heritage conservation. We can clearly learn from our Japanese colleagues with the recent inscription of the Tomioka silk mill and the impressive support of World Heritage nomination for the Kyushu Yamaguchi sites. Perhaps when next I visit, I'll have some better news about heritage conservation of iron and steel in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. ありがとうございました。それでは引き続きまして、産業遺産の本質的価値と新象性と題しまして、ニール・コソン卿にご講演いただきます。ニール・コソン卿は、産業革命発祥の地であるイギリスのアイアンブリッジ渓谷博物館の初代館長を務め、イギリス国立産業科学博物館館長や、イングリッシュヘリテージ総裁など、数多くの要職を歴任されておられます。また、リバプール海礁都市や、ポンテ・カサルテ水道橋など、産業遺産の世界遺産登録を手がけてこられ、明治、日本の産業革命遺産についても、プロジェクト当初より専門家委員会統括委員長として関わってこられるなど、まさに産業遺産の国際的権威でございます。それではニール・コソン卿、どうぞよろしくお願い申し上げます。
Thank you. And can I repeat the comments made by my colleague Patrick Martin when he opened his address? It is a great pleasure, a high honor and a rare privilege to be invited here to speak at the opening of this important and I think unique National Congress on Industrial Heritage. And perhaps I could also repeat the comments of Governor Ito and of Coco Cato in paying tribute to my colleague Stuart Smith, who sadly died earlier this year, but at least he had the pleasure of knowing that the nomination for the Kyushu Yamaguchi project had been deposited with UNESCO. What I want to reflect on today is how we understand terms like originality, authenticity, and integrity, and as a result, view history through those objects and places that we choose to take forward into the future as part of a shared past. And in particular, I'd like to view this in the context of some celebrated historic objects.